Library Science Forum series. May I at the outset remind you of the next such meeting on the 19th of April, when Judith St. John of the Toronto Boys and Girls House will be here to discuss with us the Osborne collection of children's books, and more publicity on that meeting will be forthcoming in the days to come. It is pleasant to see so many different kinds of librarians from so many different levels of librarianship present here tonight, and would that we could recognize each and every organization here, but we cannot, of course, do so because of time. I have prepared and discarded probably 3 or 4 different introductions for our speaker tonight. I could say to you that he graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1958, that he attended the infantry school, that he was a paratroop and ranger officer, that he was a company commander in 2 different airborne battle groups, that he was the aide to the commanding general of the 2nd Infantry Division, that he holds the Army Commendation Medal and the Joint Services Commendation Medal, and that he left the Army with the rank of captain. But that would not describe Dr. Lyons completely. I could say to you that Dr. Lyons holds a master's degree in management and psychology from George Washington University, and a doctorate in humanistic education from the University of Massachusetts, and that he was Horace Mann lecturer at the University of Massachusetts, and that he later became assistant to the president of Ohio University. But that would not completely describe Dr. Lyon. I could say to you that Dr. Lyon served for 2 years as Deputy Associate Commissioner of Education for Libraries and Educational Technology, and that he has just recently been appointed Director of Education for the Gifted and Talented in the United States Office of Education. But that would not completely describe Dr. Lyon. I could also say to you that Dr. Lyon is the author of a textbook on humanistic education called Learning to Feel and Feeling to Learn, which I might say by a side he would like you to buy in large numbers. But that would not completely describe Dr. Lyon. May I instead give to you a man of many parts, Dr. Hal Lyon of the Office of Education, who I might simply say, since arriving at 3 o'clock this afternoon, has become a friend. Dr. Lyons.
Thank you, Neil. Am I going to mess up the technology by stepping down from the podium? I'm already tied, and I don't want to have to hide behind the podium at the same time. Can you hear me okay in the back without that microphone? All right, I'll move closer then rather than go up there. It's, I don't know whether to pull out my speech on libraries or my speech on the gifted, but I'm sure not going to pull out a military speech. I'm sure of that. Someone told me once that you can run, but you can't hide. And I found I can't hide from all the military background. In fact, the Los Angeles Times and the Boston Globe 2 weeks ago ran an article on me, and the second paragraph said that I once received demerits at West Point for public display of affection at the University of Virginia Army football and training formation. So I can't escape that, even though it's been a long trip from West Point to learning to feel and feeling to learn. I haven't really decided what I'm going to talk to you about yet. And what I could talk, as I mentioned, about our new policies in library and educational technologies in the U.S. Office of Education, where we're trying to consider the librarian as an educator and libraries as educational institutions instead of containers for books, and where we're trying to get librarians out of this institution and into the community around them to deal with relevant problems of the community. If the people want to know how to kill rats or deal with landlords, librarians should be able to provide them with that kind of information. And this is the sort of philosophy that I could talk to you about in terms of our policy, new policies there. Or I could switch over to talk about education of the gifted and the talented, which is a whole new initiative from the Office of Education. the Commissioner of Education has recently become an advocate for our gifted and talented people in the country, and he submitted a report to Congress that brought out some startling facts. Facts such as the one that 57% of school administrators in the country think they have no gifted and talented children in their classrooms. The fact that only 4% of this country's 2 million gifted and talented children are having adequate services provided to them. And the notion that gifted youngsters will make it on their own, which is false. And sometimes they're making good dope pushers in the ghetto because they're bright enough not to get caught. The fact that they're our country's most valuable natural resource, and without some special attention, they won't realize their considerable potential. The fact that gifted children are just as prevalent in the barrio and in the ghetto and among lower income levels as they are in suburbia, and our strategy for attacking these problems. But I think I'm going to sort of set aside those fixed speeches and try to be more informal with you and chat about things that seem to come out as I look at you. I think that we have much more of our potential available to us when we don't have a fixed set of responses to things. To the degree I can be spontaneous with you, looking at you and you and you and you and others and getting some feelings from you, I'll have much more of my potential to share with you in this hour than I would have if I read a speech or lectured or did something of that nature. Fritz Perls, the father of Gestalt therapy, who recently died about a year and a half ago, had a theory about our potential, and he said that we realize maybe 5 to 10% of our potential in our lifetime. Those of us that are genius, maybe 25%. And he said that to the degree we can be right here and right now in the present, reacting spontaneously to what's happening, we have most of that potential available to us. But to the degree we have this fixed set of responses that we learn altogether too often in school, we limit our potential. And he talks about a concept of ego boundaries. He says we have this ego boundary thing, which is an enclosed space. And when you're inside that space, you're comfortable and secure, and you can be spontaneous. When you get out near the edge of it, you get anxious. And if you get outside of it, you can go into a psychotic state or freak out and really go off of your rocker. But he said that these are elastic, and we can take new risks in life and try new experiences, and we stretch these ego boundaries until we have a good-sized space in which to roam around in. And that then it's not easy to freak out. You have to go a long way out to that boundary. And he says, though, that society likes us to have this very narrow ego boundary, because then we're predictable. And society calls that character, very negative connotation for character. And the person that has that very narrow ego boundary has just a sliver of his potential available to him. So I thought I'd just try to chat a little bit about this in terms of maybe weave library, humanistic libraries, and the gifted and other things, and tie them to my personal experiences, which are more relevant to me and might be more relevant to you than some theoretical lecture from a bureaucrat in Washington. I'd like to share with you, in terms of this, some feelings that I went through a few years ago, very personal feelings, and out of those feelings came some new growth for me. West Point doesn't exactly teach you how to get into your feelings. In fact, they teach you how to deny your feelings and deal with the cognitive almost entirely. And it was very difficult for me after West Point and 7 years in the military to really get into my feelings. And I didn't know I wasn't into them until I got into them. But about 3 summers ago, I was on a lake in New Hampshire, a lake that I had spent most of my childhood summers on. And I was with my 2 children, and it was a very, very lonely time for me. And I had always outrun loneliness and never let it catch up to me, or never admitted that I was lonely. I had always gotten busy or accomplished something so that I was never lonely. There were people around, or I would gather people around me, or have a party or some kind of thing to escape loneliness. And I think many of us do that. But loneliness really caught up to me during this summer on the lake. And I had just split with my wife, who I'd been married to for 10 years. And I cried, and I literally steeped myself in my own loneliness. And it was a very painful time. But out of that, out of going behind the veneer or that shell or the numbness that I had over me, I found a whole new part of the essence of me, a part of that 85% that I hadn't been realizing of my potential. And I liked part of it. There was some creativity. In fact, I wrote this book almost entirely during that month. And I wrote a lot of poems. And I painted, and I had never painted and didn't even know I had any talent. I don't have much. But I found some talent for things that I had never realized. And another part of me, a kind of a little boy part of me, a more tender part emerged that West Point hadn't exactly nurtured. And that part of me, other people liked more than they liked the efficient shell that they had been dealing with. And to me, this was a vitally important learning experience. Abraham Maslow says that the peak experiences in our lifetime, the crises, the emotional jags of the child are so important, and that's where real learning takes place. And that if we could just treasure these emotional jags in the classroom, in the library, if we could deal with these things instead of just the cognitive level, that we would give the individual much more relevant learning experiences. And yet we avoid those things because they're painful. And I guess that period for me was a period of going into those emotional crises and those kind of jags of the classroom that I had avoided back in the classroom as I was rotated through one school after another with my Army family as we traveled around. I went to 16 different schools before I ever went to West Point. And never, I learned to shield myself from all of the loneliness and the pain. But my message in that is that the children that come to your libraries, the children in your classroom, are very much real human beings with feelings and emotions. And we can integrate the affective, their feelings, with the cognitive materials we're giving them in the form of books and in the form of learning. And when we do that, we develop the whole man and not just the intellectual part of him. And we have, unfortunately, around the country, many people who are intellectual, one-dimensional half-men, brilliantly developed intellectually, but stunted emotionally. And these people who are victims of a system that forces them into that kind of a mode can't be a total human being with us because of that. And it's very difficult to capture this part of you that you may not be in touch with. And yet there is a movement, a humanistic education movement in the country now, which fosters both the intellectual and the affective. And I think that it's so important, for example, for the gifted child who is all too frequently forced down the cognitive track, numbing his feelings as he goes along the way. It's so important for him to be able to deal with his feelings and his emotions. In my book, I talk about status authority versus natural authority. And status authority is that kind of authority that stems from the teacher or the librarian behind her desk or behind her podium, lecturing down at this inferior group of beings, or even worse, lecturing at the back corner of the classroom without looking at anyone, standing behind the podium in her doctorate and her degrees. And it's not so relevant anymore in the classroom. And I compare that with what I call natural authority, which is authority gained by sharing in a learning experience with a group of colleagues, the students. Bringing in all of your resources, your books, your experiences, your friends, and the students there in the classroom, who are probably one of the most important resources that's available to you for any kind of learning experience. Every one of you has a unique experience about anything I'm talking about that is very relevant. It's your unique way of experiencing something that I may be talking about or a teacher may be talking about. And that, in all of those unique experiences, lie a great learning experience for all the rest of you if it's something that you wish to share. So the students in the classroom are viewing this teacher who is using her status authority as not being relevant. This is one of the problems in the classroom today that we're facing, and the same thing is true in the library. The librarian that, with her superior knowledge, is going to keep those books organized and keep the students organized as well, just isn't relevant today. I had an experience about a summer and a half ago with an individual who's kind of a controversial person. His name is Baba Ramdas, and people in the Midwest don't know of that name very often. But his name was Richard Alpert back in his controversial days when he was an overachiever at Harvard University. He was a professor. He was an author of several books. He was a therapist. He was a celloist, sports car driver. He had achieved in almost all the things you could do. He had 4 or 5 grants from foundations to do research. And he dropped out of Harvard. He left Harvard and he went to Esalen Institute for a year and began to get in touch with some of the feelings of his that he had been denying for so long. And then he left there and went to India, and he studied under a very wise guru, a spiritual leader in India. And he came back and he spent time working with large groups of students. He renounced drugs, even though he was associated at Harvard with drug experimentation. And he said that you can achieve everything and much more without drugs that you could achieve with drugs, and that it was much less risky, and you could have experiences that were much more peak and much more important. And he and I spent a couple of days together, and as we were speaking, I could feel us telescoping closer together and then further apart and then closer and further. And I remarked to him that I feel us getting closer and farther apart. And he said, to the degree that we wear masks or play roles, distance comes between us. But to the degree that we both become two human beings digging each other, we get closer. And he said he was probably playing guru when we were getting further apart, or I was probably playing Dr. Lyon or Associate Commissioner or some such role. And he said, try this on your children. And I called my 8-year-old over, who was running around out in the grass, and I looked at him and he said, take your father role off now if you can. And that's a very tough thing to do, because when I look at my son, I look at him as a proud father, proud of whatever he's done, and I think, well, gee, look how I'm really proud of him. It's a role that I'm putting on. And I tried to take that off, and I did take it off, and I looked at this 8-year-old little boy, and wow, I saw a whole new kind of beauty in him, just accepting him as a human being. And he could feel me seeing this in him, and he could feel us getting closer, and I could. And he, first of all, he was really enjoying it, and then he got a little uncomfortable, and then it sort of ended. But it was just a momentary glimpse of how, when you take off a role, you can get closer to someone. And I began then to try this with other people that I cared about. Even in the bureaucracy, there were a few of those. And I found that I could get much closer to people if I didn't wear my bureaucratic role or my deputy associate commissioner role or whatever role, even the father role. And if librarians could take off their librarian role and be a human being looking at another human being, sharing their resources with them, if teachers can do that, this is kind of my fantasy of what could really happen in libraries and in classrooms and in education, and be the human beings we are. Now, that isn't to say we don't have some resources to share, and I think we should share those. And that isn't to say that we should accept everything that youth says because it came from the mouth of young people. I think those of us that believe in young people owe it very much to them to be their best critics in a constructive way and bringing them our resources, which is maybe some criticism or maybe some benefit of our experience, if that's the form it takes. For me, going from West Point and the military experience to other experiences was a long, kind of painful trip. But as I look at that, it says a lot about what happens in our society to the overachiever, or the person who is trying to do what everyone wants him to do. Carl Rogers says that when we're a little baby, we do what we want to do right after we're born. We just instinctively do things. We reach up and you grab your mother's hair and you pull it, and she says no, and she teaches you to give up this thing you wanted to do to get her love and her approval. And pretty soon she teaches you to do other things to get her love and approval, and pretty soon you give up a lot of things just to get her love and approval. And then pretty soon you learn how to do this, if you're fairly bright and talented, for a lot of people, teachers and others, and this is not bad. And pretty soon you give up a lot of your own desires just to get rewards and approval from outside, from other people, from society, teachers, and others. And he says most people don't ever outgrow that. And then, if you're fairly bright and talented, you become an overachiever who's climbing all these ladders, which is what I felt I was doing as I look back on it now, to get the rewards that teachers, West Point, and other organizations put up there for me. And if they're not rewards from within, they're rewards from outside. He says to reach what he calls psychological maturity, we have to go back kind of to being like we were as a child, but doing the things that we feel we want to do that are rewarding from us, and getting our rewards from within ourselves. And this is a hard thing to do, but when we get there, when you get to that place, you're no longer a slave to everyone else. You're no longer having to be dependent on them for all your rewards and approval. And it's a very freeing thing. And then when you give to someone, there's a lot of purity to it. If you love someone, when you're finally in this area of self-support, when you love someone, it has a great genuineness to it. You're not loving them to get something back. You're not giving them a gift to get it back. This fellow, Ram Dass, that I mentioned, he was telling me about a Hindu tradition. In the Western society, when we give someone something, we put all kinds of obligations on it, and we have a whole network of obligations that we create. Even love becomes something that we exchange or barter, and people are always owing people things. And yet, in the Eastern tradition, they have a tradition called the non-giving of gifts. And if my left hand gives something to my right hand doesn't owe my left hand anything, to illustrate this principle, because both hands belong to the same body. And there's no owing. And when we get to this place where we're free of having to serve everyone else's needs, or free of having to do things and get our approval from everyone else, then we free ourselves of these obligations quite often, and then we can give with great purity. And we give because we want to, or we share because we want to. And it's a very tough place to get. Carl Rogers says that the only way we can get there with our society encouraging us to achieve so much is to either go through therapy or to have some very rare therapeutic experiences with people not usually our teachers or our parents, maybe with lovers or friends, husbands, wives, people that we can be very open and honest and real with, and it's a painful place to get. But once we get there, we have this new kind of a freedom. And the teacher that gets there, the librarian that gets there, has a whole new gift to offer to her students in terms of being able to give without obligation. Our whole grading structure, for example, is doing things to get approval from outside. And I don't think it's bad to go through that achiever stage, because I think we learn a lot about our own talents, our own abilities. We develop aptitudes that to their potential. We realize a lot of our potential that we wouldn't. But somehow, if we can structure experiences after we've developed some of that potential, so that we can go back to this freeing kind of a state. And I'm not sure exactly how we can do it. The teacher that gets to this place also then doesn't have to be a perfect person. The librarian doesn't have to be perfect. And for me, I used to rehearse. If I was coming to give a speech, if I were coming to give a speech to you, I would have a set speech all written out. It might be better organized than this one, but I would have it carefully prepared, over-prepared, perhaps, and thereby limit my potential by not being able to stray. But it would be so carefully prepared because I was worried about looking perfect or looking like I had all the answers. And I don't have all the answers. And no teacher has all the answers. And our system tries to encourage us as a librarian or teacher to look like we have all the answers. And that takes away a lot of our humanness. Somehow the beautiful things about people are not their perfection, but their imperfection to a degree. To me, that's more human than the perfect person. Who wants a perfect librarian, or perfect teacher, perfect lover, perfect husband, or perfect wife? That's such an inhuman kind of a person. You know, the hothouse fruits of life that are raised in the protection of a artificial environment don't have near the flavor or the sweetness that the fruits grown out, exposed to the wind and the rain, seem to have. And this being perfect that we try to enforce on our students and that our teacher training institutions try to make our teachers play, this kind of a role takes away from our humanness to a large degree. And so I'm finding much more satisfaction for myself, from within me, from not having to be a perfect person or not having to try to be that perfect. And it's a tremendous burden off my shoulders, you know, not having to be perfect. And it is off of anyone's shoulders. All of a sudden you can be human. And the big surprise is that people care about you even more than they will if you try to be perfect. So this is a lesson that somehow weaves its way through my experience in terms of where I've been in the last 3 or 4 years. I guess it took me till age 32 or 3 to begin to get out of the numbness that I was in, that society cannot help but really force us into. And, you know, life is so short. If you look up at a star and you realize how many billions of years old a star is, and you compare the longevity of your life to the longevity of a star, your life is just a spark and it's over with. When I think of that, it's so important to be in touch with your feelings and to have most of that potential available and not be numb. And the message in here for gifted children and for children of all kinds of potential, the message for teachers and librarians, is one that I'm just beginning to explore, and I'm exploring it here with you as I talk about it. And to me, it's a vitally important lesson. That there are two movements in the country, humanistic education movements. One of them is a movement that says we should have a separate kind of a curriculum, much as we have physical education for the affect, and that you can explore affective exercises and things 1 hour a week with children, and then they go back to their regular cognitive classroom subject areas. There's another movement on the West Coast that says we should integrate feelings with intellectual matters, and they call that humanistic education. And this movement, for example, if you're going to teach the Red Badge of Courage in an English class or Lord of the Flies, you could break the class down into 5-person groups and have each group get rid of a member. And then the people that were gotten rid of form their own group and share with the rest of the class how it felt to be gotten rid of, and compare that with how Piggy felt in Lord of the Flies, or how the hero felt in the Red Badge of Courage when rejected from one regiment and another. Instead of memorizing and regurgitating that he deserted the 112th Regiment at 3:32 a.m. on December the 14th, which is the kind of thing that we're into much in our emphasis on the cognitive. And this group says, let's integrate feelings in the everyday subject matter, and we'll heighten the cognitive as well as teaching the affective. The other group, that's led by a person named Jerry Weinstein at the University of Massachusetts Center for Humanistic Education, says let's have a separate subject matter for the affective, a separate curriculum. And they both agree with each other quite a bit. They're not really at war. But Jerry Weinstein, for example, will go into a ghetto classroom and he'll take a basket of dime store glasses with him, and he'll say, these are special one-way feeling glasses. And he said, we're going to play with these today. This is a pair of suspicious glasses. I wonder why you two are laughing back there. I bet you were laughing at me. And that's right. That's how you use suspicious glasses. And he'll ask kids to try them on. And kid will look at the class and he'll say, "See those two kids that were talking about me?" He said, "Yeah." And he'll look at Jerry and he'll say, "Why are you in here today and the teacher's out goofing off?" And he says, "Yeah, that's the way we were." And they'll all try on these suspicious glasses and they'll voice suspicions. And then they'll try on self-righteous glasses. And he says, "Who wears self-righteous glasses?" The principal, the counselor. Every time I go down there, he says, "What are you doing back here this time? What'd you do wrong this time?" And Batman wears them. And then they'll try on those, and they'll try on what are the opposite of self-righteous glasses. And the kids will think, "You're not too much different from me" glasses. And they'll put these on and express their similarities to each other for the first time. And he'll say, "Any new kids in the class?" And a new kid will put his hand up and he'll say, "What kind of glasses does a new kid need in this class?" And he'll say, "Power glasses." And then he'll put on power glasses and he'll talk about why he needed them when he came into this class for the first time ever, that he had voiced this. And they'll talk about how it is for somebody new to come into a situation and how scary it is. And then they'll try on strong point glasses where you just see another individual's strong points. And you can just feel the ghetto classroom warm up as they express for the first time their feelings, strong feelings about other people that they've never expressed. This has been a taboo area for them. And just some exciting things can happen. My book is about these kinds of things that can be done, and it's about the whole humanistic education movement that's occurring. And it seems to me that librarians can do a lot of these kinds of things. Libraries, after all, are open to almost everyone. I think libraries have great potential that's untapped. Every dropout can go into a library. Every old person, a drug addict can go in. Anybody can go into a library and learn, people that are not allowed into the average classroom or schoolroom. And the librarian, as an educator, not just a custodian of books, can do so much to help these people nourish their potential. If she can be a colleague sharing in a learning experience with these people, bringing her resources, and they're not limited just to the books on the shelf. And this movement for humanizing the classroom is fairly new. It's being pioneered, yet it's not new because the best teachers have been doing this naturally for years. Best librarians have been this way. We were talking before dinner about some children's books that we like, and how many of you have read the book Sounder, which is a new children's book? I really recommend it to you. It's a book where a librarian helps a little black boy who's from a very poor family. It's a very sad book, a very powerful book. And a lot of people have criticized the book because it's such a sad book. I cried when I read it, and it was very painful and sorrowful, but it's a beautiful book. It won an award, I guess, last year. And in this book, the librarian gives this boy a chance to read, and he loves to read, and he goes, books are his whole life, and his dog was his whole life also, and the Sounder is the name of the dog. But the book is criticized because it was painful to some people, and just like the book Love Story was panned because it was painful to some people too, and they panned it as an over-emotional, sentimental kind of a book. And I guess I'm getting back some of the sentimentality that I lost at West Point, and maybe I'm overly sentimental in the minds of some people, but it's an important part of the essence of me that I denied for a long time. And a librarian with a book like this can give so much to a child, and some of the other really neat books like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory and James and the Giant Peach and the other new children's books that are coming out, we were talking about at dinner, are books that can just really bring joy to people and help them stretch those ego boundaries and have more of their potential available to them. I'm not sure how long that I'm supposed to talk and how much. Okay. Let me do this. Let me just share a couple of more things with you, and then we'll just kind of have an open discussion for as long as you'd like to. Another experience that I'd like to share that was a very personal experience that brought out to me what I'm trying to get across about the the overachiever kind of a thing that I've been going through occurred about a year ago, and I was at Esalen Institute, which is a very inspirational place to be anyway. It's on the cliffs with redwood trees rising up above it, and the ocean crashes against the cliffs. And they have these hot sulfa baths there, and I got up very early in the morning and went down to these baths, and I was sitting there and I was watching the ocean crashing up, and I happened to think, the ocean is so beautiful. And then it occurred to me, the ocean is also bad, quote unquote. It lashes its shorelines and erodes them, it tips over ships, it drowns people. But the ocean somehow knows the ocean is still there, and it exists, and it somehow has wisdom by accepting its own badness and its goodness. And then it occurred to me that even with my badness, that I'm good, and the ocean's beautiful, and so am I. And then I thought, well, I'd spent quite a few years discovering that I was beautiful with all my accomplishments. Now, but without those accomplishments, I was sure I wasn't beautiful. And I said, well, what if I didn't have my job? And then I thought, well, I'd still be beautiful. Then I thought, well, what if I hadn't written my book? I almost symbolically threw the book off the cliff. But then I realized the book wasn't bad, it was my need for it that was the problem. And then I thought, well, what if I didn't have my degrees? And I thought, I'd still be beautiful. What if I didn't go to West Point? I thought, I'd be even more beautiful. And what if I hadn't done what I did in high school, going out to make the football team, even though I was lighter than these other guys, and growling and tackling them just to get my father to come to a game, and he never came. And I thought, well, I'd still be beautiful. And then all of a sudden I just flipped back to a scene that I had not remembered before, and I was 5 years old, and it was at the train station in Boston, Massachusetts. My father had a duffel bag on his shoulder, and he was leaving for World War II. And my mother was there crying, and my father had a cavalier-looking mustache, and he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, now you be good and take care of your mom. You're the man of the house now. I'm the man of the house, and I'm 5 years old. And he said, you be good and I'll hurry home. You be good and I'll hurry home. And I tried so hard to be good. For 4 years he didn't come home, and I knew it was because I wasn't good enough, and I just tried to be such a good boy. And I realized that what I wanted, and I became this sort of overachiever because of that, and I really wanted to be held more. And that's probably why I was being held by society and teachers. And I realized that even if I wasn't good, I was still beautiful. And all of a sudden I was back, and the ocean was crashing up on the baths there, which are sort of cut into the cliff. And I was a little baby in the crib, and my crib was all wet, and I was thinking, bad baby was going through my mind. And I realized that I was beautiful even as a baby in a wet crib, and that I went all the way back, stripping off my accomplishments, one by one. And I realized someone must have gotten angry when I was a little baby in the crib. And from then on, I had tried to be better and better and better. And I had gained a lot from trying to be better, but to understand why I had was so important to me. And the fact that we're beautiful, even without all the right answers, even without all the perfection that we strive for, was for me a tremendous freeing discovery. And yet this society is so hung up on surface beauty, and I'm not talking about that kind of beauty. I was going to a meeting with the Commissioner of Education a few months ago and a senator, and I stopped into the men's room and I fixed my tie in the mirror, and then I thought, well, if I'm really beautiful inside, why do I have to worry about the surface? And then it occurred to me that how society is hung up on surface beauty, and the multi-billion dollar cosmetic industry is, we're worried about surface beauty. In West Point, shine your shoes, polish your brass, your uniform is immaculate. This is all surface beauty. Nobody cares about the beauty inside the person at West Point. And nobody seems to care about what's inside of us as human beings. We're worried about the shell. And some of the younger generation who are not wearing makeup seem to have some wisdom in realizing that it's not the shell, but it's the inner beauty that is really important. Carl Rogers, the famous psychologist and great author of many books, Becoming a Person and Freedom to Learn and other books. He's an old man now, has a beautiful thing that he says about sunsets. He says that no one ever tries to change a sunset. We accept it. No one says it needs a little more orange in the cloud cover, a little more pink on the left-hand side. We accept a sunset. And he said if we could only treat other human beings like sunsets and value their uniqueness, the uniqueness of our students, of our husbands and wives and friends. To me, if we can get to this place in education and as librarians, valuing the uniqueness of the people that come into the library, into the classroom, then we can have this acceptance of their uniqueness. And we can give them the kind of attention their uniqueness deserves, which is different from the uniqueness that another child deserves. And if we can reach that place, along with perhaps this place where you are free from being hung up on doing what everybody else wants you to do, when you get to that place, that rare place, and I'm not there all the time, occasionally, rare occasions I get there, and something very nice happens to me for which I have no cognitive explanation, and I hope I never get one. And I don't know how to explain it, but when you get to that place where you're feeling very good about yourself and you look at someone and you look at them and accept them as another human being and you're really centered, something happens for which I have no explanation, and it's kind of as though you become a mirror and the other person can see their beauty in your reflection, and they feel good as they look at you, and you become a mirror somehow for them. And if a teacher or a librarian can somehow achieve that state, and it's tough to describe how to get there, and it's a long, painful trip to get there. This is what my fantasy about humanistic education is. If we can get to that place where we can be mirrors for other people's beauty and share with them in our learning experiences, then this is kind of my fantasy about where we could eventually be. I think that's all I have to say, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Would you suggest that possibly there be a type of humanistic sessions or, say, rehabilitation for, well, I can say it, the older generation in the library?
I think not just for the older generation, but for a lot of us at all levels. We have so much to learn from the older generation, and yet if we can accept their uniqueness, then we can accept their resources, which is considerable in terms of experience. I think we need more training in librarianship that's this way. I don't know a lot about what happened in the West Coast at the Catholic school. Do any of you know of the experience where Carl Rogers worked with the library science school at Mount St. Mary's, or no? It's on the West Coast, and I can't think of the name of the college, but the entire college went this direction, including the library school. And it was a disruptive thing, but it was a very interesting thing. Let me share with you a thing that we were talking about at dinner tonight. When I came into the U.S. Office of Education 5 years ago now, I guess it was, I noticed that the place had a strange environment in many ways. The bureaucracy was not frightening to me, because I think university bureaucracies are usually worse than the Washington bureaucracy, and the bureaucracies at local government and state government are just as bad. But I wrote a memo after a few months there that we were talking about at the table, and Ren Lickert, a professor at the University of Michigan, did a study of 5,000 organizations throughout the country, and he identified the high-producing managers on the one hand and the low producers on the other, and he eliminated all the average people. and he found traits common to the high producers and traits common to the low producers. The high producers were very people-oriented. People were unique individuals to them. The low producers were production-oriented. People were tools to get the job done. The high producers were good delegators, and the low producers were poor delegators. The high producers allowed their subordinates to participate in decisions, and the low producers were very autocratic. The high producers were relatively non-punitive, and the low producers were punitive. The high producers, in time of crisis, they maintained their supervisory role, and the low producers rolled up their sleeves and pitched in with the work in time of crisis. If there was a hole in the dike, they put their finger in the hole, and then if another one developed, there was no one to send someone over to stop it. In other words, they gave up their supervisory role, which was an interesting one to me. The high producers had good open two-way personal communication flow. They were open and accessible. The low producers were closed and they had poor communication flow. The high producers had very few formal meetings where only one or two people talked. The low producers had frequent formal meetings where only the boss gave directions. High producers had a lot of pride in their work groups, and low producers didn't. And there were some other traits like these that Likert found in this first empirical study of this sort. And I presented these facts in my memo, and I also said that the Office of Education seemed to have all the traits of the low producer. And you could see it every day. And it was obvious to the Commissioner of Education when he got this memo that this was true. And I sent this memo to all of the head associate commissioners and the top people, the top 10 people in the Office of Education. And some of them had been there a long time and were the older group. And I got a lot of defensive responses. And you haven't been here long enough. We've grown so dynamically in program, but not enough people. Which is all the more reason to be people-oriented. And many defensive replies. And of course, one thing I did was I scrambled all the traits of the high and low producers into a rating sheet and attached it to this memo and said, maybe some of you would like to use this and have your division directors rate you, and then don't tell them what it is until afterwards, and then have a discussion and say, you just rated me on high and low producer traits, and I came out high on this, this, and this, and low on this, this, and this. Now, nobody has all the high producer traits. Those that are high producers take advantage of a few. Well, people didn't want to do that. Make a long story short, in fact, they wanted, I had made a lot of instant enemies, I realized. We then brought Chris Argyris in from Yale, who's very good at opening up people with these kinds of here and now honesty and open things. I don't say sensitivity training anymore because it's a bad word with educators, and it is obsolete. We've gone way beyond the sensitivity training thing. But Chris Argyris was one of the early sensitivity training people, and I don't advocate sensitivity training anymore. I've learned better. I've learned not to do that. But in any case, he sat down with us at meetings, and he sliced through all the hidden agendas. And after a few of these people got opened, the older, old-line people, they began to use some of these checklists and things, and they began to become delightfully open. And we began to see ourselves not as heads of our own fiefdoms, but as a board of directors for the office who could share resources. Well, we were going to let this extend down through the organization, but then we changed administrations and had a lot of disruption, and I left and to go teach at the University of Massachusetts, and the commissioner left and others. And I came back to the Office of Education with a hope to try to do this with the Library Bureau, which I ran for 6 months from its inception. And we were small enough and new enough, I felt, to try an experiment like this. And I got all the people together and I said, can we become a non-bureaucratic organization within the bureaucracy? Try an experiment. It may not work, but we have everything to gain if it does work. And I broke them down into small 10-man groups, 10 men and women groups. And I went to those meetings with them, and there was no leadership. We had no one from the chain of command as a leader of any of these groups. It was mixed with secretaries and professionals. And exciting things were happening in those small meetings. And one of them, a secretary, was saying, I'd like to see equality of human beings in our new bureau. She said, every time my boss walks in the office, he lets me know that I'm a non-professional and he's a professional, without even saying anything, just by his actions. And he was there in the room at that time, and she said, I'd like to write him a list of the 10 things that would make me appreciate him more. And he said, well, why don't you do it? And she said, I will if you won't fire me. And he said, I'd like to write you a list of the 10 things that would make me appreciate my secretary more. And she looked at him and she had a tear in her eye and she said, it would be the first time in 4 years that you would have told me anything you liked or disliked about what I've ever done. And he went up to her and kind of stiffly hugged her, and then they started laughing, though, and talking as equal human beings for the first time in 4 years. And these kinds of things began to happen. But I need to report to you that the experiment was not a success. Some good things happened, and surprisingly enough, they happened mainly with secretaries, and a lot of them were not young secretaries. The non-professional group of the Office of Education really caught on to this and began to, deal and talk with people. But as a lot of other people began to communicate in an open way without going through the chain of command, a lot of the people in the chain of command were threatened. And bureaucracies attract a person who needs the security of this chain of command, and he's threatened when people are wheeling and dealing, communicating around him without him knowing exactly what's going on. And that was, I think, one of the reasons for the failure. Another reason was that we just didn't have time to really keep the experiment going. And another reason is the bureaucracies just don't really tolerate this very well. All the classic books on bureaucracy, the one that you mentioned, Neil, Max Weber's book, says bureaucracies have to be closed to protect themselves. They have to have red tape to protect the public. They have to have these things. It's a characteristic of them. Well, to try to build a non-bureaucratic organization within bureaucracy was an interesting experiment, but it didn't exactly succeed. And it wasn't because of the older people it didn't succeed. It was because of a lot of reasons. It was a long, rambling answer to your question. Did I answer it at all?
Well, yes. My idea of the person, the staid person that doesn't go outside himself or herself, really hasn't had a chance to, or hasn't either forced himself to, or hasn't had these experiences. And that was why these institutes around, more all over the country. We had, may I tell you just one thing?
Sure.
Here on campus, we had an Education Foundation course, international course, and the ratio of international students to American students was 18 to 17, I think it was, and the number of women in the class were, say, 8, 10. And we would form in a large circle and have a pace set for the evening, and then form into small groups that may be made smaller or such. But we found a humanization rapport in this group, and as a result, in the 11 or 12 weeks of working together, learning, sharing, hesitating, patience, all this, we're a very, very close group, and we're different people than the ones that went in.
That's a really nice story. I think we need to be careful not to force people that are not open to try to be open. And their uniqueness is just as important as the open person's uniqueness, and their desire to be themselves and not have anything forced upon them is vital. So I think it's vital never to have mandatory attendance at any of these kinds of things, but that you never force a person to try to be open. It's something that it's like discovery. Carl Rogers he doesn't like the term to teach. The definition of the term to teach in the dictionary is to make to know. And he says he doesn't want to make anyone know anything. He likes the term learning facilitator. And I like the term discovery facilitator even better. And when you discover things, the learning is much more important than when you force it down someone's throat. I visited the Leicestershire schools in England a few summers ago, and I was intrigued by what was happening in some of the classrooms. 45 children in a classroom with one teacher and no aides, and they see that as a fairly average-sized classroom. And no control problems. Children are controlling themselves, and they have little learning center areas, and it's really discovery is what they're doing. They're discovering all kinds of things. In one corner there was a section where the 7 and 8-year-olds were helping the 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds learn how to read. And there was a rule in the classroom. Everyone had a little word book chained to his belt, and it was just a small little book. And in that book were that person's personal, private words that he knew and was very proud of. He knew how to spell them and say them. And if a child said something, was challenged by another child on how to spell that, then if he couldn't spell it, he had to go over to this little section, and there was a little girl there, and she'd say, "What's the word?" And he'd say, "The word is damn." And he was angry at somebody, and he wanted to say, "Damn you." And so she would write it out, D-A-M-N, on this card, big letters, and then he would copy it in his book, and he would spell it, and he'd go to the next section and they'd ask him to spell it, and he'd spell it, and the third thing, and he'd go running out, and he'd say, "Damn you," and it was, he said it with real meaning. This was his word that he had discovered and earned, and it was the whole concept of letting children discover things was so apparent there. And I think it's important to let people discover these things. And have you read the book Siddhartha? To me, the most fascinating thing in the book, of course, is toward the end when Siddhartha is with. How many have read that book? How many have read the book Steppenwolf? It's funny. It's interesting that in the Midwest too, Hesse doesn't make it into the Midwest very much like he does in the East and West Coast. But in the book Siddhartha, he discovers at the end he has his son with him, and he wants to explain to his son all the pitfalls of life that he stepped into, all of the crises he's had, the tragedies of his life, so that his son can avoid having these same tragedies and crises and have a better life. And the old man who's there by the river explains, if you do that to him, he'll never realize his real potential as a great man. He'll never become a great man unless he has the same mistakes and many more mistakes, unless he gets into the same trouble that you got into and gets out of it on his own, unless he discovers for himself these things. The other book by Hesse, Steppenwolf, was a book that was important to me too. In Steppenwolf, the fellow is a wolf of the steppes, which is a lone wolf in many ways, and he goes home from the academic environment that he's in, where he's being very nice and saying all the things people want him to say, and publishing and doing research and all the things you have to do to get ahead in the academic environment. And he goes home, and his apartment is a wreck, and it's just the part of him that wants to come out is this rampant wolf. And one day he's at a cocktail party, and he's with the people he's been with for 4 or 5 years, and he's saying the same old nice things that he doesn't mean. And finally he says, the wolf sort of emerges in him, and he says, "The hell with you!" And he goes out in the street, and he's out there, and he's going through the street walking, and he's trying to decide, am I crazy to do this to those people that I've been with for all these years? Or maybe they're crazy, and maybe this is the sane part of me. This wolf is coming out in him, and he wonders, maybe the people are insane that are locking up the people in the insane asylums, and maybe the people in the insane asylums are really more sane, and they're just letting the real parts out. And he's going through the street, and I was going through a similar thing, wondering if this discovery of my tender and parts and my emotional parts, the part of me that was hiding behind emotion, was really crazy, or whether that was really more honest and real. And he sees this person going through the night and early in the morning, and he's got a sign that says, "Come to the Magic Theater, for madmen only. Price of admission, your mind. Not for everyone, not for everyone." And there's a little address, and he's trying to see that. And I was going through realizing that to stay in our mind all the time it's an easy way. It's a safe place. That I want to tell you another story about Columbia University. But in terms of staying in your mind, it's sort of for madmen only to get into your feelings and emotions, and it's not for everyone. And yet there's a lot there that's important. He goes on to get into his feelings and emotions. But the story I want to tell you about Columbia University, I was fortunate to help them with the crisis at Columbia, with a conference that they had after the crisis called Columbia After the Crisis. And they invited to this conference at a big estate all of the key faculty members, the key student leaders, everyone on the board of Columbia. Buckminster Fuller and other interesting people were there, plus an outside group of voyeurs to look in on this and give objectivity, I suppose. And the Outsiders, interesting group, people like Eric Erikson, the psychologist from Harvard, John D. Rockefeller III, presidents of major foundations. And I was fortunate to be with that group. And Carl Rogers was there. And when we arrived, he had broken us down into small groups. He was brought in at the last minute to help organize the conference. Some faculty members were so upset about Carl Rogers being there and being put into what they thought were sensitivity groups that they left and didn't stay for the conference. Several did. But in the group that I was in, we were in a circle, and we were talking about the crisis at Columbia and about how we felt about it. And this one chairman of the physics department, a very star faculty member who's well known, began to back his chair away from the group slowly. And about 30 minutes later, you could notice that he was sort of maybe 3 or 4 feet out from the group. And Carl said, "Hey, I have a feeling you're trying to withdraw from the group. You're backing your..." And he said, "You're damn right I am." He said, "I didn't come up here to be psychoanalyzed. I came up here to learn. And learning takes place on an intellectual level. And I came up here to learn about what caused the problem at Columbia." And he said, "And you're all into your feelings. And he said, any of you that are serious enough about this to want to learn about it, let's go into the other room and we'll have an intellectual discussion." And then a student or a president of a foundation said, "Now I'm beginning to understand a little bit more about what's happening at Columbia." And the student said, "That's exactly it. Anytime we try to deal with them as human beings, they retreat to their safe intellectual planes where they can't be challenged because they're the world's experts on those subjects. And they won't deal with us as human beings. And they put us down as human beings because we don't have this intellectual knowledge that they have. And we have as many questions about our human selves, our feelings, as we do about the intellectual." Well, we got down later into a huge big room with the whole group assembled, and the students had asked for an hour to try to bridge a communications gap, which ironically enough the president of Columbia had said did not exist at Columbia. He said, "One thing we don't have is a communication problem here. We've been open." Very naive statement for any university president to make nowadays. But in any case, there was a student with long hair and a Jesus Saves t-shirt on. And he was up there and he had tears rolling down his face just trying to get his point across to them about how he felt. And he said, "The trouble, none of you will admit you've made a mistake in your life." And he went to the president of Columbia and he said, "Take off your presidency just for a minute. Admit you've made a mistake in your life. Show me there's a human being underneath and I'll be able to accept you more." And the president said, "It's not my policy." And he said, "To hell with your policy." And he had tears rolling down his face, he was very emotional. He was just a very articulate student who, without any notes or anything, was weaving the Bible and literature into what he had to say. And he was a very gifted individual. And he said, it all boils down to a dichotomy of feelings versus intellect. Or to put it another way, morality versus duplicity. And he sat down. And Eric Erikson, the psychologist from Harvard, well, first of all, a faculty member popped up, as he invariably did, and started in on a lecture. And Eric Erikson got up and interrupted him. He said, "Just a minute." He said, "I don't think anybody heard what that student said." He said, "I think it's very important to this whole conference." He said that the students view the faculty members as being intellectual, and they view that as being somewhat immoral, and they view it as being duplicity because they're not dealing with their whole selves. They're just dealing with the intellectual part. And they, as students, see themselves as being moral and being whole. And in spite of who they're sleeping with or what they're smoking, they see themselves as being much more moral and more as total men, not one-dimensional half-men. He said, and in that issue lies the crux of the problem at Columbia and at other universities around the country. I've forgotten what the question was. Any other discussion or questions or? Yeah.
You had an opportunity to examine the concept of leadership from several different kinds of angles here. Where are you now on the concept of leadership?
I feel that the question. Did you hear the question? Neil alluded to the fact that I've had a chance to look at leadership from several angles, and he wanted to know where I am now with it. And I think that I believe that this people-oriented style of leadership with those high producer traits are where it's at, and yet no one has all of those traits. Even in the military, the principles of leadership that are taught at West Point and other places, they teach you don't have all those traits of leadership. You have maybe one or two, and you take maximum advantage of those. And these traits of leadership that I mentioned, I think have relevance not only in the military, where the people-oriented military person, believe it or not, and in spite of the stereotype that exists, he's the more effective leader. And there's only top 2 or 3% of the military are that kind of leader, but they're the most effective, the people-oriented guys. It also works in bureaucracies. I think that the teacher that's that way is more relevant, more effective in the academic world. I think it's true in business and industry, which Likkert's research shows us. And I think it's true in all walks of life. And it's just a nurturing of another person and caring about them as a human being. That doesn't mean you accept everything they say. It doesn't mean that you love everybody. That's pretty indiscriminate to love everybody. It means that you can accept their uniqueness and where they are. So I guess that I don't profess that I'm always that kind of leader, but that's the kind of leadership that I would think is most important. Yes. Okay. The new effort for the gifted and talented in the country will not have a major influx of federal funds from our office. But for the first time, the federal government and the U.S. Commissioner of Education and the rest of us are holding this up as a national objective. And we're becoming advocates for the gifted and talented. And we know we cannot reach in the next year or so every one of the 20,000 school districts in the country with funds or programs, but we can reach the 50 states. So we're going to, and there is a high correlation between a full-time State Department level effort and good programs within the state. And there are only 10 states in the country that have full-time efforts with a full-time person. So we're going to concentrate on reaching the states, and it's kind of an advocacy effort. We have approximately $1 million over the next 2 years to use for a Leadership Training Institute, which is a mechanism to bring together the country's leading experts on the gifted. And I'm going to get my humanistic thing into this by bringing Carl Rogers in on our Leadership Training Institute, and other people that will tailor up for tasks with. We'll involve hundreds of people literally, but we'll bring them in, for example, to develop a package of how to do it materials for state departments. We'll get successful state people and other people. We'll bring in a group to make a package of materials for parents that want to get a school going for gifted children. And parents have done more for gifted children than any other group. They have stimulated more good programs. We'll have and that'll include parents and students. We'll bring a group in to develop packages for elementary and secondary schools. In addition to the packages, we're going to have 10 regional teams around the country. In each of the 10 OE regional offices, we have a gifted and talented officer who, working with the state people from his 6 or 7 states, plus the Leadership Training Institute members, will form a team to try to pair off the weaker states with the strong states. We're going to do some other exciting kinds of demonstration things. The Smithsonian Institute approached me, and they have 40 expeditions planned for the next 2 years being led by the world's leading scientists. And they, when they talked to me about this, last year they took 5 or 6 gifted students on one of the expeditions to a volcano in Africa, where in the summer they climbed this volcano and they tried to figure out how it was formed, and they're with the world's expert on volcanoes, and they camped out on the rim of that volcano overnight, and he talked about his life and his feelings and the different careers he'd been into. And now all of those students consider themselves apprentices to him. They're all writing to him. They've gone back to their schools and presented programs on what they did. And the idea was maybe we can get a way to bring gifted teachers or librarians with some gifted students on some of these expeditions. And so we would take 2 teachers with each expedition, and the teachers or librarians would choose some students, and we'd put some other students there in a national competition. We'd have gifted students who would go on these expeditions. The only trouble was the expeditions were financed, but we needed about $1,000 per head for the students and teachers, which ran to several $100,000, which was too costly for the Office of Education. Though I was so excited by it, I said I'd look for money. And then the other day, the Explorers Club executive director, have you ever heard of the Explorers Club? It's founded back in 1904. Admiral Byrd and other famous explorers have been members, and it's a very aristocratic club. And I was talking to them about this idea, and after the discussion, the fellow said to me that they had a fundraising campaign for education, and they have a lot of wealthy donors that were members. And he said, we'll give you $300,000 for this if you'll give us $15,000 for the administrative costs, which we can't spend. And so I didn't even have the money, but I said, you're on. To get $300,000 for 15 was just too good, and I knew I'd get it somewhere. So we're going to do that project, hopefully this coming year and the year after. And we're going to set up a clearinghouse for the whole country for gifted and talented children, building on top of one of the ERIC clearinghouses that the Council for Exceptional Children runs, because we can get 3 or 4 times more for our money by piggybacking on top of their handicap clearinghouse. We're going to have another neat project. We're going to develop at least 10 community mentor projects throughout the country. And these projects would be volunteer communities, and they would have a charrette. Do you know what a charrette is? It's a process where you bring people from multidisciplines, students, doctors, lawyers, businessmen, architects, librarians, together to plan a problem, to attack a problem. And the problem will be, how do we help our country's or our community's most valuable natural resource, our gifted children? They'll inventory the resources of that community, human and non-human. Maybe a fish hatchery and a library is a resource, and certain industries a resource, but there are people that are resources. There may be a senior citizen who's taking his knowledge to the grave with him, who works well with children, who wrote a history book 30 years ago, who works well, and he may volunteer Friday mornings to work with children, and an old cabinet maker may volunteer Wednesday afternoons, and a sculptor may volunteer, and a musician, and a business executive may say he'll take a gifted youngster on Thursday afternoons in his office with him. And we'll get all the resources pardon me, that we can together in that community, and the librarian will be a booking agent. And she'll have a roster by subject matter. Under history, she'll have 3 or 4 historians' names that are in the community that have volunteered with their phone numbers. And the schools will watch for gifted children who want to go further than the teacher can take the average class, send them to the librarian. And the kid will come and say, I've been sent and I want to learn about history or sculpture or whatever, and she'll go down the roster and she'll dial on the phone for him, this guy, and she'll say, I have a student who wants to talk to you, and the kid will talk to him, and they'll make an appointment for Friday afternoon, and they'll let him out of school. He'll go up there, and if they like each other, that's important, they negotiate a day a week maybe, or an afternoon a week, and the school will let him out, and that's an important part. And he'll go up there and work with that person, and then he'll come back to the classroom and lead a seminar, or be a teacher's aide, or help the librarian get together some good packages of materials on that subject, and share this with the rest of the classroom. And then, as gifted children frequently do, he may be frustrated about whether he should be in science or whether he should paint. And this is the kind of frustrations that gifted children have. They can do well in many areas, and then he could go back to the library and say, I'm tired of history, but I'd like to do some sculpture, and she'd help him. And in this way, we feel the whole community would have a sense of participation in the education of their children. And you could get a lot of community pride going in a community to do this, such as Muncie, if you wanted to organize this here. And also you do some things, there'd be some serendipity in this, that unplanned for side effects. You might bridge some generation gaps. You might give something meaningful for senior citizens to do in working with children. So we want to develop at least 10 of these, and we can do them they're costless. I mean, we can do it with volunteer people, we feel, for no money. And we're going to have each of our regional teams try to develop at least one in the next year. There are other things like that we're going to try to do for the gifted and talented. We're going to develop training materials for teachers. We don't think we need any more master's programs, even though there are only 12 universities in the country that have gifted and talented master's level and up programs. We think we need in-service programs, because you can change a teacher's attitude with a little bit of information in a week or less to make her an advocate for the gifted, whereas she'll be hostile toward the gifted, and she'll think the gifted can make it on their own, and have a lot of the other false notions that exist without a little bit of the right kind of information. So we want to develop programs like that. In addition, we're going to do a little bit of research, but we spent 10 years researching the gifted child, and how to identify them. We haven't done anything for them, so even if we miss some of them, we want to do some things for gifted children, and we want to persuade states to spend more of their money. Mrs. Lanham here is doing a study for the state. She's heading the task force for the state of Indiana on what Indiana's approach ought to be for gifted children. And maybe you have some ideas that you could feed to her and her task force that's at the State Department level. And she's going to, hopefully, with some help from us and other stronger states in this area, develop a program for this state for the gifted and talented. Would you like to say something about it? So we hope to develop, in terms of research, some applied materials that can be used, building on the research that's been done instead of a lot more pure research. And we don't have a lot of money for that anyway. There is a bill that's been introduced by Senator Javits, Senator Williams, and 11 other senators, both sides of the aisle, for the gifted and talented. But this is an election year, and we're not holding our breath for that bill to pass, though it might get through the Senate. The prognosis for it getting through the House is a pretty dismal one, I think, at this time, although eventually a piece of legislation like that would be very good to give us funds. There are existing funds, such as Title III of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, and other funds with LSCA could be used for gifted projects, and librarians have done as much for gifted children as anyone else has done. So we're hoping that to marshal the existing legislative authorities and resources within states primarily to steer them toward gifted children and talented children. Yes, sir.
Will this include gifted people who are handicapped, physically or otherwise?
Yes, it will, and we have funds available now that can help us in that area. The Bureau of Education for the Handicapped funds cannot be used for gifted individuals unless they're handicapped, and so I am working with them to put a lot more of their money into gifted handicapped individuals who are suffering from being handicapped but who have considerable potential, and sometimes giftedness is a handicap. The hostility that gifted children suffer, the state of Rhode Island right now, there's a tremendous controversy over children who have been sent to the doctor to be given tranquilizers and drugs because they are disrupting the class, and it's under the rubric of learning disabilities. They're labeled, and the policy in Rhode Island is to give them drugs. And a study that was recently done there showed that 75% of these children were gifted individuals asking too many questions and upsetting the classroom. And when they were taken out of the classroom and given special experiences, they, being grouped with their peers, they all just flourished. And so it's this kind of a controversy is erupting around the country as people realize that we owe each of our children an education that is commensurate with their ability, be they handicapped, gifted, or average. Other questions? It's kind of been, how much time have we used up? You've been sitting still why don't you stand up a minute and stretch your legs and sit down, and if you have any questions, I'll be up here for a while and be happy to meet with you and answer them.
Coffee out there, if you'd like to drink coffee and
Coffee?
out there.
I understand there's coffee outside, and we can just chat informally.
Okay.